Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was the seventh and final king of Rome, reigning from 535 BC to 509 BC. A terrible reign that saw him embody all of the negative traits of the previous kings and multiply them by 10. In fact, his reign was so terrible that it would spur Rome into booting him out of the throne, and would put them off the idea of kings altogether. Instead, the Roman Republic was established. Even his name Superbus, which is Latin for proud and arrogant, reflects exactly the type of king he was, most notably being too proud to bury the former king Servius Tullius, whom he had killed in the street. It would also see to him being referred to as Tarquin the Proud. We don't know much about Superbus's life, given that many of the kings from this time are shrouded in myth and legend. Even his lineage is somewhat obscured, with some believing he was either the son or grandson of the fifth king of Rome, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. What we do know, however, is the dastardly and bloody way in which he ascended to the throne. The former king, Servius Tullius, came to be king through suspicious means. He was not chosen by the people like the other kings before him, but instead ushered into the throne by his adopted mother, Tanaquil, also the queen at the time. In the wake of the death of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, who was likely assassinated by the sons of the former king, King Ancus Marcius, Queen Tanaquil had made her adopted son regent, giving him more of a political claim to the throne once the news became public. Despite the fact that Tanaquil already had sons, she was said to prefer her adopted son Servius Tullius, a boy who she began to believe was a gift from the gods. If Tarquinius Superbus was the son of Tarquinius Priscus and Tanaquil, and not the grandson, you can see where his resentment would have likely stemmed from. Not only was he eligible for the throne, but his own mother had shown favoritism to a boy who wasn't even their blood. He would have likely viewed Tullius as lesser, given that he came from either the slums or another conquered kingdom. Some say that Tullius was the son of a princess, but that Rome would have likely consumed the kingdom in its expansion, making all of its people secondary citizens in Rome or even slaves. Naturally, Superbus would not have seen Tullius as his equal, and to see his mother consider the boy a gift from the gods and to go on and hand him the throne would have inspired bitter jealousy. Servius Tullius understood that he had not been chosen by the people. It's possible he would have even rejected the throne on this basis, believing that he should not have been the one to rule, given that he was not a blood relative of the king or queen. But the council, probably under the influence of the queen, insisted, and soon Servius was king to a people who had not chosen him. It's not known how he was initially received, but it's likely he was met with some skepticism and maybe even shunned. It wasn't until the people began to notice that Servius Tullius had the people's best interest in mind did they begin to root for him. Some would say he was a very fair king, taxing the rich, and ensuring the poor and lower class plebeians received an acceptable standard of living. He also saw the plebeians gain foothold in the political structure, and gave hope that one did not have to live forever in the circumstances that they were born in, a notion which may have been very common at the time. But there were those, mainly the upper class patricians, who were losing out in this new kingdom, who detested Servius Tullius. Tullius was aware that their bitterness would lead to contempt, and it would only be so long before his rule was challenged. In an attempt to secure his dynasty, Servius Tullius married his daughters, who in history were known as Tullia Major and Tullia Minor, to the next king Lucius Tarquinius Superbus and his brother Arruns Tarquinius. The elder sister Tullia Major, who married Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was described as being mild-mannered and content. She did not want for anything more, and came across as quite ordinary in a kingdom filled with so many ruthless and cunning personalities. Of course, this mundaneness could not keep an ambitious man like Superbus content for long. His eyes soon began to wander to her sister, Tullia Minor, who had married his brother, Arruns. In comparison, Tullia Minor was fierce and hungry. She wanted power and was not shy in her disposition. You might say that they had been massively mismatched in their marriage, or maybe Servius Tullius had planned for this, for he foresaw the threat that Tullia Minor and Superbus would pose should the two of them become a union. Despite any efforts to prevent this, Superbus and Tullia Minor soon saw each other out, especially seeing as Arruns was unable to please Tullia in the same way that Tullia Major was unable to please Superbus. However, instead of just having an affair and eloping like normal people, Superbus and Tullia Minor killed their siblings and then married each other. Together, they would have 4 children, 3 boys who were named Titus, Sextus, and ironically Arruns, after the brother that Superbus had murdered. They also had a daughter named Tarquinia. The women of ancient Rome appear to have been perhaps even more devious and cunning than their male counterparts. Sure, man ruled the kingdom and took the glory in battle, but if we look through the reigns of some of these kings, women are key parts of their success. The second king, Numa Pompilius, was often said to consult a woman, some say goddess, named Egeria, who would give him counsel and teach him how to rule his people. The fifth king of Rome, Tarquinius Priscus, was inspired by his wife Tanaquil, who told him he could be king based on the omens she could supposedly read. She was also noted as being one of the main drives in Priscus's life, goading him on and planting seeds in his head, manipulating him to succeed. She was also responsible for the positioning of Servius Tullius on the throne, essentially outlining the power of this woman, that she was able to position not 1, but 2 kings on the throne. Tarquinius Superbus' wife Tullia Minor is no exception. She, like Tanaquil, planted seeds in her husband's mind, telling him he could be king, and that together they could rule Rome. It would see Superbus openly criticize Tullius and gain the support of the patricians, who detested the plebeians, who were now gaining equal positioning as them in society. Once he had enough support, Superbus went to the Senate house with a group of guards, and audaciously sat himself in the throne. He summoned the senators and continued to criticize Tullius, attacking his ascension to the throne and declaring it as void, given that neither the Senate or the people had chosen him, as was tradition. He criticized the favouring of the plebeians, the fact that the patricians had lost their lands to men of poor renown and means, and for the census, which had been introduced that incidentally revealed how much the wealthy made, causing strife within elitist communities. When Servius Tullius learned that Superbus was sitting in his throne and bad-mouthing him no less, he came to confront him. But Superbus attacked Servius, flung him down a set of stairs, and kicked him out onto the street. There he was descended upon by assassins employed by Superbus and Tullia Minor, and was butchered in the street in broad daylight. Once the kill was confirmed, it was, well, confirmed again, shall we say, as Tullia Minor rode her chariot down the street, trampling her father's corpse. Interestingly, it's noted that Tullia Minor was not the driver of the coach at first, but when the driver saw his king's body lying in the street, he refused to go any further. In a frenzy, Tullia Minor seized the reins and crushed the king under the hooves of her horses, coating herself in blood as she rode home. The street where this all took place would become known as Ricus Celeritas, the street of crime. Tarquinius Superbus would declare himself as king, ironic given that he just blasted Servius Tullius about not being chosen by the people, only to do exactly the same thing, but in a more barbaric fashion. His first act as king was what you might call an inaction, for he refused to bury Servius Tullius. He even put senators to death for suggesting that the king should have been buried, and would kill any who showed even the slightest shred of loyalty to the former king. Furthermore, he did not replace the senators he had killed, which would diminish both the size and the authority that the Senate held over Rome. As if it wasn't already obvious as to what sort of place Rome would look like under Superbus' rule, he began personally judging capital crimes himself, and ignored any advice that the Senate gave him as to the judgment of criminals. It made people very, very scared of him, that he could decide whether a man lived or died simply at the click of his fingers. His power was only further consolidated when he had his daughter Tarquinia marry Octavius Mamilius of Tisculum, a renowned Latin chief in the army. Superbus seemed to prioritize the consolidation of his kingdom with Latin towns, perhaps given the wars between Rome and the Latin people. By making allies of them, he could bolster Rome's forces like never before, and also curb the recurring battles that Rome seemed to have with these towns. He would call a meeting with the Latin leaders to discuss the terms of agreement, but a respected statesman of the Latin towns, known as Turnus Hedonius, spoke against Superbus, imploring his fellow leaders not to trust the arrogant king. He revealed Superbus's criminal ascension to the throne, and detailed the violence of his rule, warning them to keep away. Superbus realized that he couldn't shut Hedonius up by killing him. To do so would only prove his point, and he would lose the alignment of the Latin leaders. So he paid Hedonius' servant to plant a number of swords and blades in his room. Once done, Superbus called another meeting and publicly accused Hedonius of plotting to assassinate him. He ordered a search of Hedonius' room, and when the swords were found, it certainly inferred his guilt. Despite denying the accusation, Hedonius was thrown into a pool of water, and a wooden frame was placed atop his head. From there, stones were thrown into the wooden contraption, slowly causing him to drown. Convinced of Hedonius' guilt, and possibly even frightened by Superbus' creative manner of killing, the Latin chiefs agreed to assign their soldiers to form a united military front with the Roman army. Superbus engaged in a war with the Italic tribe of the Volsci, and would furthermore add to his wealth when he took the town of Susa Pomitia, a place inferred to as a pinnacle of opulence and full with riches. With his treasury even fuller than before, he went to war with the ancient city of Gabii, an area that had rejected Superbus' alliance. But taking this city by force was proving to be more difficult than anticipated. Therefore, Superbus came up with a devious ploy. He would send in his son Sextus to the city of Gabii, and he would pretend to be a defector, claiming that his father was insane and that he had turned his back on him and Rome. It's understood that the people of Gabii welcomed him given his legacy, and may have seen him, a prince, as a figure for which they could rally behind. It's with this that he was entrusted with the command of their troops, and would gain the support of the citizens, who were in awe of him. Secretly, Sextus sent a message to his father, asking him how he should proceed next. However, a story explains that Superbus did not answer the messenger, and instead took out his sword and began chopping off the heads of the poppies in his garden. When the messenger returned to report this to Sextus, Sextus knew immediately what needed to be done. He banished the soldiers on false charges, had some exiled and or imprisoned. Those in higher positions he had murdered, after which he opened the gates of Gabii and beckoned his father's forces to advance. With Gabii's soldiers killed, imprisoned or banished, and with the leaders of the city now headless, Superbus had no difficulty taking Gabii. In essence, you might say that his son Sextus literally was an army of one, in that he was able to cripple the city from the inside, all by himself. By 509 BC, it's safe to say that the people of Rome were quite sick of Superbus. Not only had his warring ways put them into a constant state of concern, but the way he had acquired the throne and treated those who disagreed with him made them like him even less. Many feared him, but it seems many had become straight up annoyed by him. We understand that Superbus actually destroyed a whole load of Sabine monuments and shrines to make way for his own temples, and that his incessant building made locals angry. Matters were only made worse when Superbus decided the way in which he'd appease the unrest was to make another war, one against a wealthy and ancient Italic nation known as Rutuli. Not only were the people outraged by this, but it wasn't even a successful war. Superbus's promises of spoils and riches from Rutuli weren't even met, and he had to settle for sieging the city, as opposed to broadly marching in and claiming it as he had planned. But then even the siege failed when the soldiers in the Roman army got bored and started drinking instead. It would start up a most peculiar topic amongst the noblemen in the army, the subject of whose wife was the most loyal. Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the son of Arruns Tarquinius, the murdered brother of Superbus, claimed that he had the most loyal wife, whose name was Lucretia. During the siege, it seems that the noblemen took some time off to visit their wives in secret, only to find out that their wives were all partying. When they visited Collatinus' wife though, they found her to be doing housework and to be most beautiful. Evidently, she was declared as being the most loyal of all the wives, and Collatinus received a pat on the back from his soldier buddies for securing a nice piece of arse. And that would have been the end of it, had Sextus Tarquinius not been present. Surely known as a war hero, having taken the city of Garbi by himself, Sextus became infatuated with Collatinus' wife. And what could be more fitting to a hero of Rome than a beautiful woman by his side? Sextus visited Lucretia a few days later and made advances on her, but Collatinus' boast of his wife's loyalty turned out to be true. She refused him profusely, but when he threatened to kill her after threatening to spread a rumour he'd caught her in bed with a slave, Lucretia submitted to Sextus, so as to spare her own life and to spare her husband's shame. After Sextus had left her bed, she immediately sent for her husband and her father, telling them both of what had happened. Unable to live with the shame of what had taken place, Lucretia killed herself. Needless to say, Collatinus was furious by the whole affair, and only furthermore enraged when his wife took her own life. He rallied the forces of her father, Spurius Lucretius Tricipitinus, and his friends Lucius Junius Brutus and Publius Valerius. And it was these men who would swear an oath to expel not only Sextus, but his entire family from Rome. This included the king. Lucius Junius Brutus was actually the head of the king's personal bodyguard, known as the Celeres, and with such an honour, he was entitled to summon the Roman committee. He told them of the grievances that Rome all held against Superbus, from his bloody ascension to the throne to the way he treated his own subjects. He also bruited the tale of Lucretia's rape, and the event sent ripples of outrage throughout the community, causing the committee to have no choice but to revoke Superbus' kingship. It seems that the rape of Lucretia was the final straw for the Roman people. They turned against Superbus and his family. Tullia Minor was cursed by a mob that had gathered outside her palace, and she grew so concerned by their intense hatred that she fled into exile. Her ultimate fate remains unknown. Sextus Tarquinius, meanwhile, feared for his life. He was, after all, now a rapist, a defiler, and the cause of his father's downfall. He could not return to the palace, given that the mob was already waiting for him, nor could he return to his father, who would surely eject him for his actions that had led to his own exile. So with nowhere to go, Sextus returned to his former place of glory, Garbi, probably hoping to receive the same adoration he had received when he was last there. Of course, this time the people viewed him as a snake, and he was quickly assassinated. Two consuls who would hold joint power over Rome instead of the king were elected, the first being Brutus and the second being Collatinus. When this news reached Superbus, he sought out the Italic region of Etruria for support. He was sent forces to bolster his army and prepared to march upon Collatinus and his former bodyguard, Brutus. Brutus learned that Tarquinius Superbus was planning this attack, and so he began to ready his own forces in what would be a deciding battle for the leadership of Rome. However, in a twist of fate, Brutus rejected the aid of his ally Collatinus and would actually send him into exile, all because he bared the now hated name of Tarquinius. Collatinus, despite being the man who probably suffered the most at the hands of his own family, and despite being the man who arguably brought about the end of Tarquinius' rule, soon became detested by the people, simply because he himself was still a Tarquinius in name and blood. Given that he was in a position of power as a consul alongside Brutus, he inspired revulsion in the people, who refused to take orders or instructions from any Tarquinius ever again. Collatinus opposed this and tried to explain to both the people and Brutus that he was nothing like his family, but when his father-in-law Tricipitinus weighed in and echoed what everyone else was saying, Collatinus willingly stepped down for fear he would be made an example of. Tricipitinus resumed his position as consul. What's interesting about this tale is that Brutus was actually a nephew of Superbus, But his condemnation and the condemnation of the people against the blood of Tarquinius never seems to apply to himself. Whether or not Brutus had kept his bloodline secret at the time or not is not known, but this was unlikely. It's possible that because he did not carry the Tarquinius name, he was exempt from the denunciation and the purge of the now hated royal family. Still plotting to reclaim the kingdom, Tarquinius Superbus sent ambassadors to request the return of his personal property. However, this was only a facade. They were actually there to try and recruit the leading men of Rome's military and to inspire those still loyal to Superbus to betray Brutus. The ambassadors were soon discovered though, and those who were found to be sympathizers of Superbus were executed. Ironically enough, Brutus's own sons Titus and Tiberius were found out to be part of the conspiracy and supposed sympathizers of Tarquinius Superbus. As a result of their betrayal, Brutus had them executed. The forces of Superbus, which were mainly bolstered by the Etruscan forces he'd allied with, met with Brutus and the Romans in the same year of 509 BC at what is known as the Battle of Silva Arsia. The cavalry of the Etruscan force was led by Superbus' son Arruns Tarquinius, and having studied the battlefield from afar, soon learned that Brutus was present and in command of the army. What's compelling about the story from this battle is that once Arruns learned that Brutus was the commander of the Romans, he charged at him immediately. Not one to back down, Brutus charged as well, and the two would actually spear each other to death. It may very well have been the first blood of the battle, and that both armies saw their commanders die right before their eyes. In any case, the Romans would declare victory in a narrow win over the Etruscans, but both sides received heavy losses. Tarquinius Superbus, however, lived to fight another day. Superbus only ever came close to reacquiring Rome when he sided with Lars Porsena, the king of Clusium, another ancient Italic city. Accounts do however vary as to whether Porsena was successful in taking Rome at some point, given the might of his military force. But in any case, it appears any successes he did have were quickly curbed by Roman resistance, and if he did take the city, he did not hold it for very long. Ultimately, Superbus did not reacquire Rome on this occasion, nor any other occasion for that matter. He would take one final step at reclaiming his former glory between the years of 498 BC to 496 BC, where he implored his son-in-law Octavius Mamilius, a dictator of an ancient Roman city, who'd been handpicked to marry Superbus' daughter Tarquinia. Octavius Mamilius, alongside Superbus' last remaining son Titus Tarquinius, went to war against the Roman force, the force now led by the then consul Albus Postumius Albus. Just like the Battle of Silva Arsia, this battle known as the Battle of Lake Regillus, it was hardly a decisive one, and both sides suffered many losses. Octavius Mamilius himself was slain in battle. While there was no real winner here, Superbus' forces retreated for the last time, and Rome would keep its independence from the monarchy for good. Titus Tarquinius returned to his father, and together they fled to the court of Aristodemus, a tyrant of the Italian settlement of Cumae. Superbus would only live for another year, where he died in 495 BC. While he may never have reclaimed Rome or earned back his crown, he at least escaped the wrath of the Roman people, who held him in the highest contempt. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's video, then don't forget to leave a like, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to keep notified, and I'll see you in the next video. Until the next time.